On the 7th of April, 1945, 10 Japanese warships were sunk or crippled in the East China Sea while attempting to beach themselves on an enemy-held island, and roughly 4,242 Japanese sailors died more than 300 nautical miles short of the beach they had been ordered to reach. That figure comes from the United States Naval History and Heritage Command, from an assessment written by Samuel Cox in April of 2020. American losses in the same engagement came to 10 aircraft and 12 pilots and aircrewmen. 10 aircraft against 4,242 men. The operation that produced that exchange rate carried the name Tenichigo, meaning Heaven Number 1. English accounts almost always call it Operation Tengo, and as this documentary will show, even that name forms part of the confusion surrounding the whole affair. Japanese records filed the action under a different name entirely, the battle off Cape Bonamisaki. At the center of the force sailed the battleship Yamato, the largest battleship ever built. This is not the story of that ship. The Yamato has been told and retold until the retelling became a genre of its own. This is the story of the decision that sent the fleet out, who made it, what was said in the room, what those men told each other it was for, and why historians have spent 80 years unable to agree on whether it counted as a military operation at all. The most uncomfortable possibility about Operation Tengo is not that the operation failed. The possibility is that failure was never the thing anyone in that room was measuring. To understand a decision made in the first week of April 1945, you have to understand what the Imperial Japanese Navy actually amounted to by that point, rather than what it had been in 1941, and rather than what its own doctrine still assumed it to be. The historian John Prados, writing in Combined Fleet Decoded, describes a service that by the spring of 1945 barely existed as a fighting force. That description is not rhetorical compression. It is a description of an inventory problem. The chain of losses sits clearly in the record. During June and July of 1944, the fall of Saipan and the Battle of the Philippine Sea destroyed the carrier air arm, and not simply the carriers themselves, but the trained aircrew, which is by far the harder thing to replace. October of 1944 brought the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which consumed most of what remained of the surface fleet. Yamato's sister ship Musashi went down on the 24th of October. Yamato herself engaged off Samar and then withdrew. November of 1944 saw the carrier Shinano sunk barely a week into her operational life, escorted at that moment by 3 destroyers named Isokase, Hamikase, and Yukikase, whose names will matter again before this documentary finishes. By early 1945, according to Prados, Japan still held a handful of older battleships and cruisers afloat beyond Yamato and the remnant of the Second Fleet's destroyer flotilla. None of those ships were ready for sea. Damage was not the reason. Fuel was the reason. This is the point where the Imperial Japanese Navy stops resembling a military organization and starts resembling something more familiar, which is a firm holding an asset it can no longer afford to operate. Consider the position from the inside. The Navy owned the single most expensive object Japan had ever constructed, and that object consumed enormous quantities of a commodity Japan could no longer import in useful volume. Every month the asset sat at anchor. It drained budget, manpower, and institutional credibility while producing nothing whatsoever. Selling it was impossible. Converting it was impossible. The only available options were to use it or to lose it. Any modern executive who has held a depreciating capital asset through a liquidity crisis will recognize the logic that follows. The asset becomes worth less as a working asset than as a demonstration, and once an organization begins reasoning along those lines, the question stops being what this will accomplish and becomes what it will look like if we never used it at all. Hold that thought, because it reappears in a wardroom on the 5th of April, spoken almost word for word by the Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet. Against that fleet, the United States launched Operation Iceberg. American carrier strikes against Okinawa opened on the 23rd of March, 1945. 4 days earlier, on the 19th of March, American carrier aircraft had struck the naval base at Kure and lightly damaged Yamato at her moorings. On the 1st of April, 1945, the United States 10th Army landed on Okinawa. Okinawa was not another island in a chain. Roughly 340 miles separate it from the Japanese home islands. and its capture meant airfields inside the perimeter. Every officer in the Naval General Staff understood what that meant, and the Japanese answer was not primarily a naval answer at all. The answer came from the air, in the form of the Tengo Air Plan, whose suicide component went out as a series of mass attacks designated Kikusui, meaning floating chrysanthemums. That is the context: a navy without fuel, without aircrew, and without a fleet, facing a landing on the doorstep of the home islands. Which brings us to the naming problem. Almost every English-language account of these events calls the affair Operation Tengo and treats that name as referring to the sortie of the Yamato. That is not quite what the name meant to the men who used it. Tengo named the broad air defense contingency plan covering the Ryukyus and Formosa, and it was an air operation whose suicide component went out as the Kikusui waves. The surface sortie by Yamato's force carried the designation Tenichigo, Heaven Number 1, and some sources file it under Kikusui 1, which tells you something all by itself. The surface sortie was catalogued alongside the suicide air attacks rather than alongside conventional fleet operations. Japanese naval records, meanwhile, call the action of the 7th of April the battle off Cape Bonamisaki, named for a geographic feature on Kyushu, following the ordinary convention used for naval battles. 3 names, and they are not synonyms. One names an air campaign, one names a special attack, and one names a battle. None of this is pedantry, and none of it is trivia. The naming confusion in English sources carries a consequence, because it merges the surface sortie into the suicide air campaign, and in doing so it quietly answers the central question of this documentary before anyone has asked it. If Tenichigo was a suicide operation, then judging it by military effectiveness becomes a category error, and everyone can stop arguing. Historians have not stopped arguing. The reason they have not stopped is that the men who planned this operation offered 2 entirely different justifications for it, in the same week, to different audiences, and both justifications survive in the record. On the 29th of March, 1945, the Army and the Naval General Staff briefed Emperor Hirohito on the Kikusui air plans, and according to accounts of that briefing, the Emperor asked what the Navy was doing. Stop there, because this single sentence stands as the most heavily mythologized element of the entire operation, and being precise about what is actually known matters a great deal. The remark appears in the literature in several forms. George Pfeiffer, writing in the Battle of Okinawa, renders it as a question about whether the Navy has no more ships. Other accounts render it as an inquiry about where the Navy is. Samuel Cox, writing for the Naval History and Heritage Command, describes it far more cautiously, as the Emperor asking what the Japanese Navy was doing, a remark that staff officers took as implicit criticism. No contemporaneous transcript exists. Every surviving version of the wording reaches us through post-war recollection, filtered through staff officers who sat in that room and who had their own reasons, after 1945, to describe the origins of the decision in particular ways. The wording varies widely from source to source. Any dramatic word-for-word quotation of the Emperor on this occasion should be treated as unreliable. What is credited, broadly, is the substance and the effect. The Naval General Staff took the imperial remark as criticism, and that interpretation became a political fact inside the Navy regardless of what had actually been said. This is where the institutional analysis has to proceed carefully, because 2 readings are available and they lead to very different conclusions about responsibility. The first reading holds that the Emperor's remark functioned as pressure and that the Naval General Staff responded to pressure from above. The second reading holds that the Naval General Staff was already moving toward committing the Second Fleet, and that the imperial remark functioned as a pretext, a piece of external authority that could be cited to override internal objection. Evidence does not cleanly separate those 2. The second reading draws support from the timing and from the fuel arithmetic, because the argument for using the fleet did not depend on the Emperor at all. Admiral Toyoda Somu, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, and his staff reasoned that the Second Fleet had to be used before the fuel dwindled further or before the ships were destroyed at anchor by American carrier raids that had already reached Kure 10 days earlier. Rear Admiral Toshitane Takeu put the arithmetic plainly in post-war testimony, describing it as the very last possible sortie that could have been made from the standpoint of fuel and personnel. The last gasp in his phrasing. Organizational psychologists have a name for the pattern visible here, and the name is not fanaticism. They call it terminal phase decision-making, the behavior of institutions that have concluded they are going to cease existing. Research on failing organizations shows a consistent shift. While an institution believes it has a future, it optimizes for survival, hoarding resources, avoiding irreversible commitments, and deferring risk wherever possible. The moment leadership internalizes that the institution will not survive, the optimization target changes, and it stops being outcome and becomes record. Decisions begin to be evaluated against the question of how they will read afterward to whoever is left. Bankrupt firms make otherwise inexplicable final expenditures for this reason. Departments facing dissolution spend their remaining budget rather than return it for the same reason. The behavior looks irrational only if you assume the actor is still optimizing for survival. The combined fleet staff in April of 1945 were not irrational men. Toyota and his officers were career professionals running a set of institutional incentives out to their logical endpoint, and the endpoint happened to be 4,242 dead. On the 3rd of April, 1945, the Second Fleet received Toyota's order regarding a sortie to Okinawa. On the 5th of April, at 13:59, the detailed order arrived, and that is when the combined fleet ran into a problem, because the officers who were supposed to execute the order said no. Vice Admiral Ito Seiichi commanded the Second Fleet, and Ito was the man who would have to take the ships out. According to the accounts that survive, Ito refused, and his objection was technical, and it was correct. A daylight surface approach against an enemy holding uncontested air superiority, with no air cover of his own, did not constitute an operation. It constituted a delivery of ships to aircraft. The combined fleet's response was to send its chief of staff in person. Vice Admiral Kosaka Ryanosuke flew from Tokyo to the anchorage at Tokiyama on the 5th of April to overcome the objections face-to-face. And that fact alone tells you the state of the argument. Chiefs of staff do not fly to anchorages to deliver orders that are being obeyed. What Kosaka said in that room reaches us primarily through one source, Captain Tamichi Hara, who commanded the light cruiser Yahagi and published his account in Japanese Destroyer Captain in 1961. Hara survived. His book stands as the single most load-bearing text in the historiography of this operation, and it is a post-war recollection written 16 years after the events it describes, by a participant who was not personally present for every exchange he reports. That caveat is necessary. It is also not a reason to discard the account, because Hara's version sits consistently alongside everything else documented about the decision. According to Hara, Kosaka's argument to Captain Ariga Kosaku included this, that the whole nation would hate the Navy if the war should end with the Yamato still intact. Read that sentence again, because the entire operation sits inside it. Not that the attack would destroy American transports. Not that it would relieve pressure on the garrison. The stated justification, delivered by the Chief of Staff of the combined fleet to the captain of the ship in question, concerned how the Navy would be regarded if the ship survived. Modern corporate governance contains a discipline built entirely around this reasoning, and it goes by the name of reputational risk management. Its central insight holds that institutions frequently take actions with negative expected operational value in order to avoid a worse perceived outcome. A company issues a costly recall over a defect affecting a fraction of 1% of units. A bank writes off a recoverable debt to avoid the optics of pursuing it. In every case, the calculation runs the same way. The operational loss gets accepted because the reputational loss is judged larger. Kosaka was performing exactly that calculation, weighing 4,000 lives against how an institution would be remembered, and he stated the trade openly, in front of the men who would pay it. Kosaka also raised, according to Hara's account, the disappointment at Imperial General Headquarters over Yamato's performance at Leyte Gulf, the engagement where the battleship had turned away off Samar. And according to Thomas McKelvey Cleaver, writing in Tidal Wave, Kosaka framed the sortie as a way of diverting American air power to assist the Army's suicide air effort. Both justifications went into the same room. The military one, which was to draw off the aircraft, and the institutional one, which was that the Navy could not be seen to end the war with this ship afloat. Not everyone accepted it. Captain Atsushi told that the operation's aim concerned the tradition and the glory of the Navy, responded with an outburst recorded by Cleaver, asking why the honor of the surface fleet should be more respected when the war belonged to the nation, and calling those responsible damned fools. Why set down his views in his own post-war work on the escort war, and his anger matters historically because it establishes that the honor of the Navy reasoning was recognized as absurd at the time by serving Japanese officers, and not only in retrospect by foreign historians. Ito relented. Hara's account gives the acceptance in words that have been reproduced thousands of times since, that the men were being given an appropriate chance to die, and that a samurai lives so as to be always prepared to die. Those words trace to Hara's 1961 book, and they are a post-war recollection. Variant phrasings, the fitting end and the glorious way to die formulations that appear across popular accounts, are associated principally with Russell Spur's book A Glorious Way to Die, published in 1981, which is vivid, widely quoted, and entirely unfootnoted. Its reconstructed dialogue should be treated as literary rather than documentary. The gist is credible, the exact words are not verifiable, and this documentary will not pretend otherwise. A further question sits here, and recent scholarship has begun to press on it. The image of Ito as the reluctant professional, overruled by fanatics, is emotionally satisfying, and it rests almost entirely on post-war testimony gathered after the Navy had every incentive to produce reluctant, honorable senior officers. Whether Ito's opposition has been partly retrofitted onto him remains an open question in the literature, one that cannot be settled from the available sources, and this documentary leaves it open. Kusaka himself, speaking to Hara after the war, offered a reflection that cuts in a different direction, that Ito had been prepared for certain death from the moment he took command of the shrunken Second Fleet, that few people retained common sense in those days, and that a suicide spirit had permeated the entire Navy. Before the ship sailed, roughly 80 crewmen were ordered off. Among them were 67 cadets of the Eidojima Naval Academy, class number 74, who had come aboard 3 days earlier. 6 sailors were removed, and so were the oldest hands, men over roughly 40. The cadets were summoned to the first wardroom and given a ceremonial farewell with sake. According to the account of the executive officer, Captain Nomura Jiro, they begged to be allowed to stay and were firmly refused, and Nomura's stated reason was that the officers could not bear to take them along on an expedition into certain death. Consider what that decision reveals. The officers removing those cadets were not confused about what the operation was. In order to disembark the youngest men amounts to an admission, executed in advance, in writing, with ceremony. Morale aboard the remaining ships collapsed once the crews understood it was a one-way mission. And that phrase, one-way mission, brings us to the most famous single detail of Operation Tengo, and the one most often reported wrong. The claim turns up in almost every account, that the Yamato sailed with only enough fuel for a one-way trip. Documentaries repeat it, books repeat it, and it lives in the popular memory of the operation both in Japan and abroad. It is not accurate. Here is what the sources actually establish. The operational orders authorized a limited fuel load, which is true, and which gets described variously as enough for a one-way trip, as 2,000 tons for the entire force, or as 40% of capacity. What happened at the Tokuyama fuel depot went differently. Depot personnel, in effective defiance of their orders, issued a great deal more, and Russell Spur's account describes men climbing down into the storage tanks to pump out the residue. The tonnages that survive in the literature run as follows. Mark still records Yamato sailing with approximately 4,000 tons of fuel oil, a quantity still describes as sufficient for a round trip. Yamato's listed fuel capacity came to 6,201 tons. Garsk and Doolin record the ship's fueled to 60% of capacity against the 40% authorized. Captain Hara, in his own account, gives Yahagi's load as 1,250 tons. Tabular records maintained by the combined fleet database note Yamato taking roughly 1,000 tons from the tanker Mitsushima Maru on the 20th of March, plus fuel drawn from the destroyers Hanazuki and Asashimo on the 29th. So the literal claim that the fleet was fueled for one direction only is false. Those ships carried considerably more than a one-way minimum, which is where it becomes genuinely interesting and where the simple debunking also goes wrong. Ensign Yoshida Mitsuru, a junior radar officer aboard Yamato who survived the sinking and became the operation's most important literary witness, recorded in his memoir that the ship carried only one-way fuel. Yoshida was wrong. The fact that he was wrong carries more historical weight than the fuel figures themselves, because it means the belief was circulating aboard the ship among the officers as the fleet sailed. Students of organizational communication study this phenomenon under the heading of information asymmetry, the gap between what an institution's records contain and what its members believe. The gap does not usually arise from lying. It arises from the difference between what was ordered and what was done, and from the fact that the order gets announced while the deviation stays quiet. Every large organization runs on that gap. A directive issues from headquarters and reaches the staff. Someone in operations then quietly does something more sensible and never announces it, because announcing it would mean admitting the deviation. The workforce carries on operating from the announced version. The men of the Second Fleet sailed believing they had one-way fuel because the order said so. Fuel officers at Tokuyama had already quietly overridden it. Nobody told the crews, because telling the crews would have meant documenting the disobedience, which leaves a question the sources cannot fully answer. Whether Yamato could actually have returned to Kyushu on 4,000 tons after a fighting transit and a beaching operation remains genuinely debatable, and every man aboard understood that survival was improbable regardless of what sat in the bunkers. The romantic version of this story, the defiant harbor master secretly saving the fleet with portable pumps, draws partial corroboration from Spur and gets embellished everywhere else. The truth is smaller and stranger. Some fuel officers at a depot decided, without authority, that these men should at least have the option, and then said nothing about it, and the men they were trying to help never knew. The force carried the designation Surface Special Attack Force. 10 ships. The battleship Yamato, under Rear Admiral Ariga Kosaku, who had taken command on the 25th of November, 1944, with Captain Nomura Jiro as executive officer. Aboard as fleet commander, Vice Admiral Ito Seiichi, with Rear Admiral Morishita Nobii, serving as Second Fleet Chief of Staff, Morishita having previously commanded Yamato himself. The light cruiser Yahagi, an Agano-class ship of roughly 6,600 tons completed in 1943, under Captain Tamichi Hara, with Rear Admiral Komura Keizo embarked as commander of Destroyer Squadron 2, and 8 destroyers in 3 divisions. Destroyer Division 17, under Captain Shitani Kiaichi, comprised Isokeis under Commander Maeda Sanyo, Hamakeis under Commander McCoy Isami, and Yukakeis under Commander Terachi Mazamichi. Destroyer Division 21, under Captain Kataki Hisao, comprised Asashimo under Commander Sujihara Yoshiro, Kasumi under Commander Yamana Hiro, and Hatsushimo under Commander Sato Masaso. Destroyer Division 41, under Captain Yoshida Masayoshi, comprised Futsuki under Commander Sakuma Hidechika and Suzutsuki under Commander Amano Shigetaka. Of those 10 ships, 4 would survive the day, and they were Futsuki, Suzutsuki, Yukakeis, and Hatsushimo. Of the commanding officers just named, Shitani, Kataki, Maeda, McCoy, Sujihara, and Yamana were killed, along with Ariga and Ito. One detail about the crews of these ships almost never appears in accounts of Operation Tengo, and it deserves to. Several Nisei, meaning Japanese Americans, served aboard the ships of this force as officers. Ensign Kunio Nakatani worked as a radio operator aboard Yamato and was killed at his post. Ensign Shigeo Yamada served as a communications officer aboard Yahagi and survived. Ensign Kuramoto, a radio operator aboard Yahagi, came from Santa Monica, California, and Kuramoto was killed. These were men who had been in Japan when the war began, studying, generally, and who found themselves trapped there. The choice available to them ran between collaboration and imprisonment. According to the accounts that survive, shipmates who considered themselves more purely Japanese harassed them, and they served anyway, and some of them died in the East China Sea on the 7th of April, 1945, aboard ships fighting American aircraft. A second question took considerable effort in the research for this episode and could not be answered. By the end of the war, at least 110,000 Korean conscripts had served in the Japanese Army and Navy. Military conscription of Koreans began in December of 1944 for months before this operation, and Taiwanese subjects were serving as well. The scale of colonial conscription in the imperial forces at this date is documented. What is not documented, in any source located for this episode, is the presence of specific, named Korean or Taiwanese personnel aboard the 10 ships of the Surface Special Attack Force. That is an evidentiary gap rather than a finding. It does not mean those men were not there. It means the muster rolls that would establish it have not surfaced in the accessible literature, and this documentary is not going to manufacture a specific claim to fill a hole in the record. If those rolls surface, that will be a different episode. Before the ship sailed, the crews held a farewell party aboard Yamato, and the drinking ran heavy. The Surface Special Attack Force departed the Tokuyama and Midajiri anchorage in the Inland Sea on the 6th of April, 1945. Even the exact departure time is one of the many small things the sources disagree about, with Garskin Dulin giving 1520 and other accounts giving 1600. The force steamed south for the Bungo Strait, the passage out of the inland sea toward the open Pacific. 2 American B-29s dropped bombs during the transit and scored no hits. Then, at approximately 1845 to 1900 hours, 2 American submarines sighted the force, and they were the Threadfin, hull number SS-410, and the Hackleback, SS-295. Both boats shadowed the Japanese formation and radioed its position. And the Japanese knew they had been seen, because the submarine's contact reports were picked up by Japanese radio operators as those reports went out. That is worth sitting with. Within roughly 3 hours of leaving the inland sea, the largest battleship ever constructed had been detected, reported, and had heard herself being reported, and the operation continued exactly as planned. There was no alternative plan. There was no abort condition. Detection changed nothing, because the operation did not have an outcome it was trying to achieve that detection could have prevented. Nor did the detection begin on the 6th of April. American code breaking had run ahead of this operation from the start, and the first intercepts of the execution order for what the Americans read as Operation 10 No. 1 came on the 26th of March. On the 5th of April, the day of Kusaka's visit, the day the cadets went ashore, intercepts confirmed the details of the sortie. Modern security engineering holds a principle covering exactly this, usually credited to 19th century cryptography and now standard doctrine, which is to assume the adversary knows your system and to design so that secrecy of the method is not required for the method to work. The Imperial Japanese Navy's plan violated that principle in the most complete way available. It depended entirely on not being seen, in daylight, in a theater where the opponent held total air superiority and had been reading the relevant traffic for 11 days. That critique only bites if the plan's purpose was to reach Okinawa. If the purpose was to be attacked, to draw American aircraft away from the Kikusui waves, then being seen was not a failure mode, it was the mechanism. And that ambiguity is not a modern historian's invention. The ambiguity sat inside the operation from the moment Kusaka gave 2 different justifications in the same room. At 0700 on the 7th of April, the force rounded southeastern Kyushu and turned west, a feint suggesting a course for Sasebo, and formed a circular anti-aircraft screen. At 0823, a search aircraft from the carrier Essex found them, and 2 Mariner flying boats then shadowed the formation for roughly 5 hours. At 0900, the destroyer Asashimo dropped out of formation with engine trouble. While the Japanese force steamed south, the American command was having its own disagreement, and the disagreement was not about whether to attack. It was about who got to. Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded the Fifth Fleet, and on receiving the contact reports early on the 7th of April, Spruance ordered Rear Admiral Morton Deo's Task Force 54 to prepare for a surface engagement. Deo's force ran to considerable weight, 6 battleships including New Jersey, Wisconsin, and Missouri, 7 cruisers among them the large cruisers Alaska and Guam, and 21 destroyers. Spruance's message to his carrier and battleship commanders ran to 3 words. You take them on. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher commanded Task Force 58, the fast carrier force. Mitcher had spent his professional life as a naval aviator in institutional conflict with the battleship establishment of his own navy. Mitcher launched, putting his strike into the air and informing Spruance only after the aircraft were already off the decks. According to the account given in the Tides of History, by 1530 on the 7th of April, Deo was steaming northwest of Okinawa with his battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, and by then the Yamato had already been sunk. Here is what that means, stated plainly. The last battleship action of the Second World War, the last opportunity for a line of battleships to engage a line of battleships, was prevented by an American admiral who did not want the battleships to have it. Students of organizational behavior have documented this pattern extensively, and they call it intra-firm competition for a visible win. When 2 divisions of the same organization compete for institutional survival, and a high-visibility opportunity appears, the division able to act unilaterally will frequently do so, even where coordination would produce a better organizational outcome, because the credit is the resource actually being contested. Every large organization contains that same pull. A product team ships ahead of the roadmap to claim the launch. A department publishes first to own the finding. The competitive pressure runs internally rather than externally, and it shapes behavior more strongly than the stated objective does. Mitcher was competing with Deo for the largest trophy available in naval warfare. Mitcher was not wrong about the outcome, since aircraft sank the ships comprehensively in about 2 hours. The decision was still made inside a rivalry, and Mitcher's aviators had spent 2 decades arguing that battleships were obsolete. On the 7th of April, 1945, they were handed the chance to prove it in front of an audience of American battleships that had been ordered to prepare for exactly that engagement. At 10:00, Task Force 58 launched. Samuel Cox's account for the Naval History and Heritage Command records 5 fleet carriers and 4 light carriers putting up a first wave of 280 fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers, with 3 fleet carriers and 1 light carrier launching 110 more shortly afterward. The full dispatch across task groups, in Still's breakdown, ran as follows. Task Group 58.1 sent 113 aircraft, made up of 52 fighters, 21 dive bombers, and 40 torpedo bombers. Task Group 58.3 sent 167, made up of 80 fighters, 29 dive bombers, and 58 torpedo bombers. Task Group 58.4 sent 106, made up of 48 fighters, 25 dive bombers, and 33 torpedo bombers. Roughly 386 aircraft dispatched from 15 carriers, of which approximately 227 actually attacked. Hellcats and Corsairs flying as fighters, Helldivers as dive bombers, Avengers carrying torpedoes, against 10 ships with no air cover of any kind. At approximately 10:17, Yamato fired her main battery at the shadowing flying boats. Those were 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever mounted, firing anti-aircraft ammunition at aircraft that sat out of range. The round in question was the Type 3, known to the Japanese as the Sanshikidan and to Americans as the Beehive shell. Each one weighed 2,998 pounds and held roughly 900 incendiary tubes and 600 steel stays. It was available and it was used against the flying boats and later against the strike aircraft. American pilots described the effect as more of a pyrotechnics display than an effective anti-aircraft weapon. Firing the rounds rapidly also damaged the rifling of the barrels, and Japanese gunners are reported to have disliked them. At approximately 11:30, warning came of roughly 250 inbound aircraft, and the screen widened to 5,000 meters. At approximately 12:20 to 12:30, radar detected the strike. At approximately 12:32, Yahagi opened fire, and 2 minutes later, at 12:34, Yamato's main battery opened. At approximately 12:37, the first wave, Task Group 58.1, attacked. Asashimo, already crippled and separated by engine trouble since 0900, was sunk at approximately 12:32 by aircraft, with bombers from the Sanjisino sighted. Asashimo went down with all hands, 326 men. At approximately 12:46, Yahagi took a torpedo in the engine room and lay dead in the water. At approximately 12:47, Hamikase was torpedoed and broke in half. Between approximately 12:59 and 13:40, the second wave, Task Group 58.3, attacked, putting multiple torpedo hits into Yamato, and a list to port began to build. At approximately 14:06, Yahagi was abandoned, with Rear Admiral Komura and Captain Hara both rescued. 446 of Yahagi's crew of roughly 1,000 were lost. Between approximately 13:42 and 14:23, the third wave, Task Group 58.4, attacked. Torpedo hits flooded the steering compartment, and at approximately 14:20, Yamato lost power. At approximately 14:23, Yamato capsized and her magazines detonated. Warfare History Network describes the explosion as producing a mushroom cloud more than 4 miles high, seen by sentries at Kagoshima, more than 124 miles away. Lieutenant Commander Herbert Hauck, leading aircraft from the Yorktown's Air Group 9, described it in the language of a man who had run out of adjectives: a mighty big bang, smoke going up, a fireball about 1,000 feet high. Here the documentary has to stop and be honest about something, because the sequence just narrated is more precise than the evidence actually supports. How many bombs and torpedoes hit Yamato remains genuinely unknown, and the disagreement between sources is not rounding error. It runs to a factor of 3. Garsk and Doolin record 8 bombs and 11 confirmed torpedoes, with 2 more probable. Mark still gives 7 bombs and 9 confirmed torpedoes, with 3 probable. Skulski and Draminsky give 19 bombs and 35 torpedoes. Russell Spur gives a range of 8 to 18 bombs and 11 to 16 torpedoes. David Hamer gives 2 or more bombs and 10 torpedoes, while Faulkner gives 3 bombs and 10 torpedoes. For Yahagi, Skulski and Draminsky estimate approximately 12 bombs and 7 torpedoes. American After Action reporting inflated claims a great deal, and the torpedo bombers of Task Group 58.3 alone claimed 29 torpedo hits. Japanese survivor accounts came from men who were under attack, below decks, or in the water. Multiple authors have concluded that an accurate timeline of the attack is virtually impossible to reconstruct. Any documentary that hands you a single confident number for how many torpedoes sank the Yamato is handing you one source's reconstruction, and not telling you it is one source's reconstruction. What is clear is the failure of the defense. By April of 1945, Yamato mounted approximately 24 5-inch dual-purpose guns in twin mounts, and roughly 162 25mm anti-aircraft guns in 54 triple mounts, on top of her 9 main guns. That entire arsenal brought down approximately 10 aircraft out of nearly 400 committed, and roughly half the exposed anti-aircraft crews were killed by strafing and bombing during the engagement. American pilots deduced from the colored bursts and the pattern of the beehive fire that the Japanese gunners were relying on visual rather than radar fire control, and, in the phrasing of the American accounts, that they were missing with great consistency. That is a saturation failure, and the same mathematics governs any defensive system with finite throughput facing a concentrated load. Modern network security understands this precisely. A distributed denial-of-service attack does not defeat a server by finding a flaw in it. It defeats the server by presenting more simultaneous requests than the system can process, at which point the quality of the individual defensive response stops matching. The system does not fail because it is bad. It fails because it is finite. 162 guns is a large number until roughly 227 aircraft attack from multiple bearings and altitudes at once, for 2 hours, against a target with no fighter cover to thin the attack before it arrives. At that point, the defensive arithmetic is decided before the first round is fired. The Imperial Japanese Navy had spent the war progressively adding anti-aircraft guns to its capital ships, and on the 7th of April, 1945, The accumulated result of that entire program cost the United States Navy 10 aircraft. When it became clear the mission had failed, Vice Admiral Ito Seiichi shook hands with his staff and went to his cabin to go down with the ship. His adjutant attempted to follow and was forcibly stopped, reportedly told that he did not have to go and should not be a fool. Captain Ariga Kosaku is reported to have lashed himself to the binnacle on the bridge. Both accounts rest on post-war recollection. Both are plausible, widely repeated, and not independently documented. Ito was posthumously promoted to full admiral. At approximately 1520, the surviving ships signaled headquarters, and at approximately 1750, the reply canceled the operation and ordered withdrawal to Sasebo after scuttling the cripples and recovering survivors. Isokase was scuttled by Yukikase, and Kasumi was scuttled by Futsuki. Approximately 1,620 men were pulled from the water by the surviving destroyers, taken from Yamato, Yahagi, Hamikase, Isokase, and Kasumi. An American mariner flying boat also recovered several Japanese survivors. Japanese reports state that American aircraft strafed survivors in the water. The same reports also record that American attacks ceased against destroyers actively engaged in picking men up. The survivor Naoshi Ishida, interviewed for the Nova documentary Sinking the Supership in 2005, described Americans opening fire with machine guns on the men floating in the water, forcing the survivors to dive under. This documentary presents that as what it is, a serious claim resting largely on Japanese survivor testimony, contested and not resolved by the available record, which brings us to the most difficult source in this entire history. Ensign Yoshida Mitsuru survived the bridge of the Yamato and wrote the book published in English as Requiem for Battleship Yamato. It stands as the foundational Japanese account of this operation. It is also literature, and its status as documentary evidence is disputed by historians. The specific problem is documented. According to work by Kurihara Toshio and by Hara Katsuhiro, Yoshida's widow Yoshiko stated that one of the book's most disputed passages, describing a severe act of violence during the sinking, was not something Yoshida personally witnessed. It came from second-hand testimony given by an artillery officer who had been rescued by the destroyer Hatsushimo, and Yoshida rendered it in an eyewitness voice. Yoshida's son, who holds the estate, has declared that the text will remain unchanged. That is not a scandal, and it is not a fabrication in the ordinary sense. It is what happens when a survivor writes a memoir intended as a requiem rather than a report, when the purpose of the text is to carry the dead rather than to catalog them. It does mean that the most emotionally powerful account of this operation, the one that shaped how an entire nation remembers it, contains at least one central passage that its own author did not see. Historians now handle Requiem for Battleship Yamato as a literary memoir requiring corroboration, which is the correct handling. It is also a loss, because it removes the one document that felt like direct access. The dead figures differ by source, partly because some counts include Ito's Second Fleet staff in Yamato's complement, and some do not. For Yamato, Garsk and Dulin give 296 survivors out of 3,332. Skulski and Draminsky give 277 from the same complement. Still gives 276 out of 3,331. Spur and Prados both give 269 survivors. Hara gives 269 survivors from a smaller complement of 2,767, a figure that omits some staff. The by-ship breakdown compiled by Abe Saburo in 1995 runs as follows. Yamato, 3,056 killed. Yahagi, 446. Asashimo, 326, all hands. Hamikase, 100. Suzutsuki, 57. Isokase, 20. Kasumi, 17. Futsuki, 12. Yukikase, 3. Yukikase lost 3 men. The aggregate figure, approximately 4,242 dead, comes from the Naval History and Heritage Command and stands as the best sourced total available. Lower composite figures circulating around 3,700 generally undercount the escorts or use Hara's reduced complement. Survivors reached Sasebo around noon on the 8th of April, 1945, which leaves the question of what Operation Tengo was actually for. 80 years of scholarship has not produced an agreed answer, and here are the positions, stated as their advocates make them. The operational reading comes from John Prados, who argues in Combined Fleet Decoded that the Yamato force was genuinely intended to draw American carrier aircraft away from the Kikusui waves, and that with better coordination between the Second Fleet and Vice Admiral Matome Agaki's Fifth Air Fleet, the sortie could have opened a real window for the suicide attacks. Prados faults the execution rather than the concept, since the Kikusui waves went out on the 6th and 7th of April rather than being timed to Yamato's planned arrival on the 8th. That reading has support. Kosaka made the argument in the room on the 5th of April, according to Cleaver. Yoshida recorded understanding the mission as bait to pull American aircraft off Okinawa. Pieces published through the United States Naval Institute in 1995 support the decoy intent, at least, as a stated purpose. The institutional reading comes from a different group. Marx still describes the sortie as a ceremonial vehicle for the destruction of the Imperial Japanese Navy's last remaining symbol, rather than a serious plan with any hope of contributing to victory, and as another instance of the bankrupt strategic planning that characterized the Navy at that stage of the war. Garskin Doolin put it more bluntly, describing a desperate plan, drawn up by desperate men who were out of contact with reality. Ivan Morris, writing in The Nobility of Failure, frames it culturally rather than militarily, connecting the sortie to a long tradition, the tradition of Kusunoki Masashige, in which honorable death against hopeless odds is itself the objective, and success is not the standard being applied. Most careful historians now hold a position that includes both a nominal operational justification, genuinely articulated, layered over what amounted in practice to a symbolic sacrifice with negligible military prospect. This documentary is not going to resolve that, because the evidence does not resolve it. What the evidence does show is that both justifications were alive simultaneously in the minds of the men who ordered the sortie, and that this is normal. Institutions under terminal pressure do not generally choose between a real reason and a face-saving reason. They hold both, and the proportion shifts depending on who is being addressed. One document captures this better than any historian's analysis. On the 8th of April, 1945, the Combined Fleet sent a commendation to Rear Admiral Komura, praising the force's gallant self-sacrifice which, in the commendation's wording, had enabled the special attack aircraft to achieve a great war result. Captain Hara, who had swum out of the Yahagi the previous afternoon and watched 446 of his crew die, recorded privately wondering what great result had actually been achieved. Nothing in the record answers Hara's question. On responsibility, the sources point in several directions at once. Toyota and the Combined Fleet staff issued the order. Kosaka enforced it in person when it was refused. The Naval General Staff generated the political pressure and may have manufactured the imperial mandate for it. And the institutional culture of the service, what Kosaka himself called a suicide spirit that had permeated the entire Navy, supplied the framework in which the order was thinkable at all. That distribution is characteristic, and it forms the central finding of institutional failure theory as applied to disasters in aviation, in nuclear power, and in finance. Catastrophic institutional failures almost never trace back to a single decision by a single identifiable actor. They emerge from a chain in which every individual link is defensible in isolation. The staff officer who drafts the plan is following the strategic guidance. The commander who signs it is acting on the political situation as briefed. The subordinate who executes it is following a lawful order from a superior who flew in personally to deliver it. Every participant can point to the participant above and the participant beside, and every one of them is telling the truth. The failure lives in the structure rather than in any of the men, which is precisely why structural failures repeat, and why the post-war practice of identifying a villain and stopping there does not prevent the next one. Operation Tengo had no villain. It had a chain of professionals, each behaving rationally inside the incentives presented to them, and 4,242 men at the bottom of it. The survivors reached Sasebo on the 8th of April, 1945, and were then held in isolation for approximately 2 weeks. The reason was not medical. The reason was to keep the news from leaking. Navy Minister Yanai Mitsumasu informed the emperor. The Japanese public was not told. The largest warship ever built had been sunk with most of her crew, along with a cruiser and 4 destroyers, and the country in whose name it had been done was not informed. On the American side, the reaction stayed muted as well, though for a different reason, since the sinking failed to generate much coverage. Attention returned almost immediately to the ground campaign on Okinawa, which would run until June and produce casualty figures dwarfing anything that happened in the East China Sea on the 7th of April. The 4 surviving destroyers went on. Hatsushima was probably the only ship of the force to come through entirely undamaged, and on the 30th of July, 1945, she struck a mine in the Sea of Japan and sank, the last Imperial Japanese Navy destroyer lost in the war, 16 days before the surrender. Yukikaze survived everything. Escort duty had taken her alongside the Shinano to that carrier's destruction in November of 1944. Through the whole of the 7th of April, 1945, Yukikaze lost 3 men. Intact at the surrender, she was handed to nationalist China as reparations, renamed Tanyang, and was finally scrapped in 1971, 26 years after the operation that killed 4,000 of her fellow sailors. The historian Brett Walker used that ship as the frame for an entire study of the war, published by Cambridge University Press in 2024 as Yukikaze War. Japan surrendered on the 15th of August, 1945, for months and 8 days after Operation Tengo. The Yamato sank in April of 1945. What happened to her afterward, in memory, is arguably the more consequential story. Yoshida's memoir appeared in 1949 and again in 1952, and it seeded a film in 1953. 1974 and 1975 brought the animated series Space Battleship Yamato, broadcast in the United States as Star Blazers, which recast the sunken battleship as a redeemed vessel rising from the seabed to save the world, a franchise remade repeatedly across 5 decades. In 2005, the film Oda Katachi no Yamato, directed by Sato Junya and produced by Katakawa Haruki, became a box office success, and it used the 1/10 scale model built for the Yamato Museum in Kure. That museum, the Kure Maritime Museum, opened on the 23rd of April, 2005. Its centerpiece is the 1/10 scale Yamato, roughly 26 meters long. It also displays a Zero fighter, a Kaiten human torpedo, a 41-centimeter gun from the battleship Mutsu, Type 93 and Type 95 torpedoes, and the handwritten wills of sailors who died aboard. More than 1 million visitors came through in its first year. A major renovation reported at roughly 6.8 billion yen began in November of 2022, and the expanded museum reopened in 2026. This memorial apparatus is contested, and the terms of the argument matter. James Orr's book The Victim as Hero, published by the University of Hawaii Press in 2001, stands as the standard academic study of how post-war Japan came to understand itself primarily as a victim of the war rather than as its instigator, a concept usually rendered as Higeisha Ishiki, meaning victim consciousness. The Yamato sits at the center of that process. A ship that never fought a successful action, sent out on an operation with no realistic military purpose, sunk with 4,000 dead, becomes in post-war memory the emblem of sacrifice, technological achievement, and national tragedy. The historian Yuki Tanaka has criticized the Kure Museum along these lines, arguing that it promotes a nationalist narrative foregrounding engineering prowess and heroic sacrifice, while under-addressing what the Navy those ships belonged to actually did across Asia. The defense of the museum holds that it presents industrial and engineering history, and that it functions as a complement to Hiroshima's peace narrative rather than a competitor to it. The scholarship on the popular culture is more interesting than either position. Tekawawa Shinichi, writing in the Electronic Journal of Contemporary Japanese Studies, argues that these works carry both readings at once, that Space Battleship Yamato and the 2005 film can be read as conservative nationalist texts and as pacifist, anti-militarist texts, and that both readings are available in the material because the material is genuinely ambivalent. Robert Farley has noted that the popular depictions, tend to render the destruction as heroic, but also as pointless and futile. That combination, heroic and pointless at the same time, without resolution, is not a failure of the storytelling. It may be the most accurate thing anyone has said about Operation Tengo. The wreck itself was searched for in 1978 and 1982, identified in 1984, and surveyed for the first time on the 1st of August, 1985. A second survey in December of 1999 established the explosion sequence, with the forward magazines detonating and breaking the ship, followed by the aft magazines. In May of 2016, Kure City conducted a third survey using the remotely operated vehicle Hakio, producing roughly 50 hours of video and around 7,000 photographs. That survey concluded the wreck is better described as 3 main sections rather than 2, and it documented deterioration of the bow and of the chrysanthemum crest mounted there. The ship lies at a depth of roughly 340 to 345 meters, between 110 and 200 kilometers off Kyushu. The wreck is a war grave holding more than 3,000 men, and that status sits at the center of an ongoing dispute. A Kure-linked panel chaired by Saikoro Okahara, including the museum director Kazushige Tadaka, has at times proposed raising parts of the wreck, the main guns, and the bow, both to memorialize the dead and to make the operation legible to generations with no living connection to it. Many bereaved families oppose any physical salvage, and so do cultural authorities. The argument is not about history. It is about whether the men down there are evidence or whether they are buried. Memorial services are held annually around the 7th of April, centered on the battleship Yamato War Dead Monument in Nagasako Park in Kure. On the 7th of April, 2025, the 80th anniversary, roughly 300 people attended, bereaved families along with personnel of the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force. A small number of survivors were still alive and giving testimony as of the 2005 Nova documentary, among them Naoshi Ishida and Kazuhiro Fukumoto. Yoshida Mitsuru, who wrote the Requiem, died on the 17th of September, 1979. Operation Tengo is usually filed under fanaticism. It is the example people reach for when they want to argue that the Imperial Japanese Navy had stopped thinking rationally by 1945. The record does not support that reading, and the reading is comfortable in a way the record is not. Every man in the chain was thinking clearly. Toyota understood the fuel arithmetic and understood that the Second Fleet would be destroyed at anchor if it was not used. Kosaka understood exactly what he was purchasing with 4,000 lives and said so out loud, the Navy standing, in a country that would judge it afterward. Ito understood the operation was militarily hopeless and went anyway, because refusal was not available to him inside the institution he had served for his entire adult life. Nomura understood well enough to put 67 cadets ashore 3 days after they arrived. The fuel officers at Tokuyama understood well enough to break their orders quietly and give the ships more oil than the plan allowed, and then to say nothing about it. Not one of those men was confused. That is the difficult part. The 4,242 died because a series of competent professionals, each operating rationally inside a structure that had stopped being able to produce any other answer, arrived together at a decision none of them individually would have defended on its merits. That structure was not unique to the Imperial Japanese Navy, and it did not end in 1945. It is the ordinary architecture of institutional failure. Visible in any organization that has concluded its own survival is no longer the thing it is optimizing for. The Yamato lies in 3 pieces, 340 meters down, roughly 110 kilometers off Kyushu, with more than 3,000 men still aboard her. The wreck has been surveyed 3 times and photographed 7,000 ways, and every survey has produced better images and no better answer to Captain Hara's question about what great result was achieved. There was no great result. There was a fleet that had run out of everything except reasons, and a chain of rational men who could not find the point at which any one of them was permitted to stop.